Pam Bondi's entrance into the national spotlight wasn't quiet, it was seismic. Known for her unapologetic stance and sharp legal mind, she wasn't one to tiptoe around controversy, especially when it came to defending the integrity of the courts. So, when news broke of a sitting judge whose actions many believed crossed the line into dangerous territory, she didn't hesitate. Cameras clicked, microphones were raised, and the air around the courthouse felt heavy, thick with anticipation. And then, with the calm but pointed confidence she's known for, she spoke. The courtroom wasn't just a place for legal arguments that day. It became a stage for what felt like a much bigger reckoning. Pam Bondi took to the podium, her tone even but laced with unmistakable fire. She didn't waste time with pleasantries or legal niceties. What she delivered was a precise, uncompromising dismantling of the judge's recent behavior. A behavior she claimed undermined the very essence of what the judiciary was meant to stand for. She painted a picture of a court system under siege, not from outside forces, but from those within who were entrusted with upholding its highest values. Her words cut through the noise, framing the judge's conduct as not just an overstep, but as a betrayal. She described actions that blurred the lines between impartial justice and personal bias, where decisions felt driven by ideology rather than law. And to her, that wasn't just troubling, it was dangerous. The crowd listened, some nodding in agreement, others clearly rattled. But regardless of which side of the political line people stood on, one thing was clear. Bondi was speaking to something bigger than the moment. She was speaking to the fear that if the judiciary wavered in its independence, if judges started acting more like political actors than legal arbiters, the system that Americans rely on could begin to fracture. And once that crack appears, she warned, it doesn't take long for the whole thing to break apart. In her usual fashion, she didn't rely on vague generalities. She laid out example after example, citing case precedents and drawing attention to inconsistencies that had gone overlooked. She highlighted how certain rulings seemed to align too perfectly with partisan interests and questioned whether justice had been replaced with agenda. And she didn't mince words when it came to what she believed the consequences would be if this behavior wasn't checked. Bondi's message was clear. The bench is sacred. It's where citizens turn when every other institution fails them. It's where fairness is supposed to outweigh influence. And when a judge forgets that, when they lean into power instead of principle, it doesn't just damage a case or a courtroom. It chips away at the trust the public holds in the entire system. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, not in volume, but in conviction, her words echoing through the room and, eventually, across headlines nationwide. By the end of her address, the atmosphere had shifted. She hadn't just called out a judge, she'd put the entire judicial establishment on notice. Her stance wasn't about left or right, it was about right and wrong. And in that moment, Pam Bondi wasn't just a former prosecutor or political figure, she was a watchdog for justice, a fierce defender of a system she feared was starting to drift from its moorings. The message had been sent, loud and clear. Lines weren't just being blurred, they were being erased. That was the sentiment radiating from every word Pam Bondi delivered as she addressed a controversy shaking the judicial world to its core. A judge had stepped beyond what many believed to be the professional boundaries of impartiality, and Bondi wasn't about to let it slide. What began as whispers in legal circles had turned into a thunderous national conversation, and at its center stood a reckoning over power, responsibility, and the threat of politicized justice. She didn't hold back. In her trademark style, sharp, assertive, and unapologetically direct, she detailed how the actions in question weren't just questionable, but emblematic of a much deeper rot threatening the foundation of the courts. She argued that the robes worn by judges were supposed to represent neutrality and honor, yet recent developments showed a stark departure from that standard. The decisions made, the language used, and the posture taken by the judge painted a picture that was anything but neutral. To Bondi, it wasn't about a single case or ruling, it was about a trend, a dangerous one. She spoke of a judiciary that seemed to be leaning into ideological battles rather than rising above them. Her voice didn't shake, but it carried the weight of concern. A concern that the lines separating justice from politics were being deliberately crossed. In her eyes, it wasn't just an individual misstep, it was a signal to others that power could be wielded in ways that suited personal or political beliefs, and that the checks once thought to keep such impulses in place were weakening. She laid out her argument meticulously, drawing from both recent history and time-honored legal principles. She pointed to behavior that resembled activism more than adjudication, decisions that raised eyebrows not for their outcomes, but for the obvious tilt in their reasoning. She warned that this was how institutions lose their credibility, not all at once, but piece by piece, as trust erodes and agendas replace objectivity. The real issue, Bondi emphasized, wasn't just the conduct itself, it was what it represented. If one judge could step outside the bounds of judicial propriety, what was to stop others from doing the same? And if the public began to view courtrooms as battlegrounds for political ideology instead of havens for fair judgment, the damage would be irreversible. She painted a grim picture of what that future might look like, where citizens could no longer count on courts to protect their rights, because those courts had become pawns in larger, more dangerous games. Bondi's remarks weren't just a call-out, they were a warning. She wasn't trying to score political points. She was raising an alarm. Her words echoed with the belief that once judges begin to act like partisans, the entire system begins to collapse under the weight of bias. And for a nation built on the promise of equal justice under law, that collapse wouldn't just be a failure of leadership, it would be a betrayal of the Constitution itself. Her delivery was powerful, not because it was loud, but because it was clear. She brought attention to the quiet corrosion of judicial norms and how quickly those norms could vanish if not fiercely defended. There was no room for passive concern anymore. She made it clear that the time for silence had passed and that every moment spent ignoring the erosion of judicial boundaries only accelerated the damage. As the controversy intensified, attention began shifting in a new direction, not just toward the judge whose actions sparked outrage, but toward the silence that followed from the highest levels of judicial leadership. In moments of crisis, leadership is tested not just by what is said, but by what is left unsaid, and in this case, the silence was deafening. Pam Bondi wasn't content to let it go unnoticed. She saw it as more than just hesitation. It was complicity. And in the face of what she described as a serious breach of judicial conduct, that silence felt like a betrayal of the very oath taken by those sworn to protect the integrity of the court. Bondi's tone sharpened as she addressed the growing concern. While the headlines focused on one judge's behavior, she began drawing attention to the broader consequences of inaction. Where, she asked, was the leadership? Where was the firm hand that should have intervened to remind the nation that the judiciary still held itself accountable? In her view, the lack of response wasn't just a misstep, it was a signal that the rot might run deeper than anyone expected. She laid it out plainly. The public doesn't expect perfection from its institutions, but it does expect accountability. And when a judge appears to bend the law to fit personal views or wield authority in ways that threaten impartiality, someone at the top must speak. The absence of that voice, Bondi argued, wasn't neutrality, it was abandonment. It left the public with no reassurance that someone was watching, someone was protecting the values the courts were built upon. Without that reassurance, trust begins to crumble. Bondi didn't speculate or theorize. She pointed to the silence as a form of leadership failure. She challenged the idea that remaining above the fray was noble, especially when the very credibility of the judiciary was being questioned. In her view, staying silent in moments of institutional crisis doesn't elevate the court, it isolates it. And when isolation becomes detachment, the result is a leadership void. That void, she argued, was already being felt. She spoke of consequences, not just for public perception, but for future decisions. When the court fails to check itself, it invites others to question its legitimacy. She described a ripple effect where lower courts begin to mimic the unchecked behavior, where legal norms start to stretch, and where rulings no longer carry the same weight of respect they once did. All because no one at the top chose to step in and draw the line. Bondi also emphasized that this wasn't about politics, it was about principle. In her words, real leadership requires risk. It means stepping into uncomfortable spaces, speaking when it's easier to stay quiet, and standing up for the institution even when it means standing against a peer. She was clear in her belief that silence in this moment would be remembered, not just by legal scholars, but by every citizen who looks to the courts as the last line of defense against injustice. Her message echoed far beyond the legal community. To many, she voiced a frustration that had been building quietly, that those entrusted with defending the system had grown too cautious, too careful, too removed. She challenged that caution directly, asking what good leadership is if it only shows up when things are easy. Her words landed with weight, not because they attacked an individual, but because they demanded more from an institution that once demanded excellence from everyone within it. She stood as a reminder that leadership isn't a title, it's a responsibility. And when that responsibility is ignored, the fallout doesn't stay within court walls. It spreads, shaking the foundation of justice itself. What began as a clash over one judge's behavior quickly evolved into something far more consequential, a battle over the soul of the judiciary. Pam Bondi's fiery takedown wasn't just a critique, it became a spark, igniting a national conversation that reached far beyond the courtroom walls. At stake, she argued, was nothing less than the future of judicial integrity. And as her words gained traction, it became clear this wasn't a routine political dispute. It was a defining moment in the ongoing fight to preserve the impartiality of America's courts. Bondi's message wasn't subtle. She described a system under threat not from external enemies, but from the erosion of values within. The judicial branch, long seen as the most stable and apolitical of the three, was showing signs of strain. In her view, recent actions were proof that the lines separating justice from ideology were being deliberately erased, and if that process continued, the damage would go far beyond one courtroom or one case. She warned of a tipping point, a moment where the public would no longer believe that the courts could be trusted to act fairly. Once that confidence is broken, she said, it is nearly impossible to restore. Her fear wasn't hypothetical. She described a reality in which rulings are met not with respect but with suspicion, where verdicts are seen not as expressions of the law, but as extensions of political will. That, she argued, was the real threat. Not any single judge, but a system that slowly stops functioning as a neutral arbiter and begins to resemble yet another arena for partisan warfare. Bondi spoke with urgency. She reminded audiences that the judiciary was meant to be the last refuge, the one branch of government where Americans of all backgrounds could go, regardless of power or position, and expect a fair hearing. That promise, she said, was sacred. And if it's lost, there's no institution left to hold the line. The clash unfolding before the public wasn't just about ethics or decorum. It was a test of whether the system still had the strength to police itself. Bondi framed her intervention as a necessary act of protection, a way to draw attention to a slow-motion crisis unfolding in real time. She pointed out that corruption doesn't always come in the form of bribes or overt misconduct. Sometimes it arrives quietly, wrapped in the language of legal legitimacy, shielded by titles and traditions that no longer reflect their original meaning. Her critique landed hard because it wasn't about partisanship. She was calling for a return to first principles, impartiality, accountability, and transparency. She challenged other leaders to step up, to acknowledge that defending the system required more than tradition. It required action. In her view, failing to address the creeping politicization of the bench was nothing short of a dereliction of duty. Public reaction to her stance was swift and divided, but undeniably engaged. Legal scholars, commentators, and everyday citizens began weighing in. Debates sparked in classrooms, newsrooms, and dinner tables across the country. People weren't just talking about one judge anymore. They were asking deeper questions about whether justice in America still stood on solid ground. Bondi's confrontation, while targeted, became a rallying cry. She had thrown down a challenge to the legal establishment, prove that the courts still work for the people, prove that justice isn't just a word engraved on marble, but a principle alive in practice. And she wasn't going to let the moment pass without demanding answers. Her message, integrity in the judiciary, isn't optional, it's everything. In the wake of Pam Bondi's explosive remarks and the national attention they garnered, the conversation around judicial integrity has reached a pivotal moment. Her bold stance didn't just illuminate the cracks forming in the foundation of the American legal system. It forced the nation to look inward and ask uncomfortable but necessary questions. What happens when those entrusted with interpreting the law begin to act beyond its bounds? What becomes of justice when the guardians of impartiality appear to take sides? And perhaps most crucially, who is willing to stand up when the very core of judicial independence is on the line? Bondi's confrontation marked more than just a reaction to one judge's behavior. It served as a mirror reflecting the broader state of the judiciary. In an era where trust in institutions is rapidly eroding, the courts have long been viewed as the final stronghold, objective, principled, and above political fray. But that perception is now under siege. Whether through silence from leadership or open displays of bias from the bench, the integrity that once shielded the judiciary is beginning to feel vulnerable. The storm Bondi stirred isn't likely to die down soon, and maybe it shouldn't. Injustice doesn't always arrive in grand, visible forms. Sometimes it creeps in through minor lapses in accountability, through the quiet acceptance of partisanship, or through the normalization of judicial activism dressed in legal jargon. Bondi's decision to speak out at personal and professional risk challenged that complacency. She reminded the public that justice must not only be done, but be seen to be done. And that transparency, courage, and accountability must exist at every level of the system, including its highest ranks. Her message carries weight because it transcends political identity. It strikes at the universal need for fairness, the human desire to believe that someone, somewhere, will protect the rights of the individual against the whims of power. Without that belief, the social contract begins to fracture. Bondi's warnings, while specific in context, were timeless in principle. When power is unchecked, when silence greets misconduct, and when courts are used as tools rather than arbiters, democracy itself begins to unravel. But there is still time. Time to course correct. Time for those in power to acknowledge what's at stake and act with the urgency the moment demands. Time for the public to demand better. Not out of partisanship, but out of a shared commitment to the rule of law. Pam Bondi's voice may have led the charge, but the responsibility doesn't lie with her alone. It rests on every citizen, every legal professional, and every leader who claims to stand for justice. The judiciary doesn't belong to a party or a personality. It belongs to the people. And if this moment serves any purpose, it must be to remind the nation that preserving the court's credibility is not a passive responsibility. It requires vigilance, it requires courage, and it requires the will to speak truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Especially then.